The American Teilhard Association podcast features conversations and interviews which explore the life, thought, and vision of mystic scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. We express our gratitude to Dalesford Abbey in Paoli, Pennsylvania, for allowing us to use their space and equipment in making this episode possible. Part 2 of our 3-part conversation on Teilhard and Jung begins with a discussion on their thought and vision. We then transition to discuss their encounters with institutions. Please click the like button and please click the subscribe button on whichever platform you are tuning into this podcast on. We would also be so grateful if you might leave us a kind review. Finally, you can support the American Teilhard Association by going to teilharddechardin.org/donate. Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our 3-part series on Teilhard and Jung. Our conversation today is going to focus on these two men, their thought, their vision, and especially the challenges as well as opportunities that were presented to them through their engagement with institutions in particular.
Yes.
So I'll start about talking about Teilhard's ideas in a way that really don't highlight his tension with the institution, but rather kind of lay them out in a way as to really highlight what we were talking about at the end of our last conversation, where he was leading with science. He was leading with empiricism in this way. So, I mean, the two of them are thinkers that provide us with visions that, like I said, provide some difficulties for institutional thinking in institutions, yet there hopefully are some pathways to growth and expansion and development within here too. So,
of course.
When we are looking at Teilhard's theology, his spirituality, it really accounts for this principle of not just personal salvation, but of universal or cosmic salvation as well.
Yes.
Like I said, he's laying this out in a very empirical, systematic, scientific way. He has his principles of complexity and consciousness, right? There is material complexity in our universe. There are the quarks and atoms and molecules that make up the entire density of our being. And then there is a rise in awareness or consciousness that comes with that rise in material complexity, right? The more complex material structures become, the more consciousness they exhibit as well. So we have the human person exhibiting a higher degree of consciousness, whereby we could even say that there's certainly a consciousness within animals, within the many systems of nature, and we could go to a very reductionist level of like rocks and dirt and dust, and to say there's a very, very diminished and minuscule level of consciousness there, something that brings those disparate elements together, right? So that is a kind of, bare bones foundation to Teilhard's thought and where he's coming from with how the universe is evolving. We're moving from this Big Bang moment where it's this creation moment, this incarnational, incendiary beginning of all things, and not that much is going on complexity-wise or consciousness-wise, to fast forward 15.4 billion or however old the universe is years later, and we arrive at these great accomplishments of humanity that exemplify these increases in complexity and consciousness. And I'm thinking of things like global communication, global travel, the internet, right? The way that we are able to show there is a layer of mind present too, which Teilhard calls the noosphere. And that's a result of this increase in complexity and consciousness, right? We have technology now that allows us to connect through Zoom and through satellites and things like that. But really that's a byproduct of that noosphere, is a byproduct of socialization, of all these little parts coming together in the same way that the different elements of complexity come together and form larger conscious structures and realities. That's also, what's happening socially as well. So Teilhard looked to, especially on the battlefield, he saw the different movements of formations of soldiers moving together, working toward a common goal. He thought of the bees and beehives, or the ants and ant colonies, and how they have social structures to achieve common goals and to survive. That's certainly what he saw on the battlefield as well, right? But then he started to recognize how on the human level there is this planetization that is taking place whereby we are waking up to, we are becoming conscious of our global connection or just our universal connection with each other in that way. And that's where we start to get to this idea of universal salvation or cosmic salvation, whereby there is not just a cosmogenesis that's taking place. The cosmos is not just coming into being, but there is a Christogenesis. There's a Christification of the universe, whereby through that process, that steady increase of complexity and consciousness, there is a goal, there is an endpoint that we are ascending and transcending to, and that's what he calls the omega point, which is that fullness of God's presence in created reality. We might say it's the maximum point of complexity and consciousness in reality or in the universe. And that, like you talking about Jung and the unconscious, collective unconscious, was not something he created. He just brushed the dust off it and put a label on it and said, this is what we can call it. And that's the same thing with Teilhard and the omega point. Of course, he's heavily influenced by Scripture, especially St. John and St. Paul, where he's talking about God becoming all in all, and that transformation that occurs where he says it is no longer I, but Christ who lives in me. Teilhard sees this larger consciousness as winning out, if you will. Whereby we eventually wake up to our highest level of, now I'm going to cross boundaries here and use a language that's more in your camp, but of psychological development, which is a level of spiritual realization whereby we realize we're all connected. We're all brothers and sisters in the divine, in God. We're all children of God. So, that is where Teilhard's thought leads us, whereby, yes, that model does account for personal salvation, but it also accounts for a model of salvation that is inclusive in some ways of cosmology. We go into astronomy and all of these other further fields of study now, like I was talking about earlier, that are quite maybe not mystical, but they lead us in the dimensions of uncertainty. Right? Is it a particle or a wave? Like, what's the fundamental unit of reality? Well, if we are to follow Teilhard's path of study here, his scientific, systematic unfolding, we're heading in the direction of love, which is quite a mystical thing in and of itself, right? So, that's to kind of give the groundwork for where Teilhard is coming from with his thought. It kind of, highlights some of that sense of struggle that he went through too. Even though he lived through the war, he was able to still have this really quite, some call it rose-colored vision, Some people think he was overly optimistic, but, it's the kind of thing where only through immersion in his words and in his thought are we able to maybe get a sense of what he's really talking about there. So, now I'm, curious to hear how you might explain Jung's theories when it regards the development of the individual as well as the development of the collective, because there is that primordial and preeminent force of the collective unconsciousness.
Yes. Wow.
So that was a big question. So how does Jung view consciousness, which you already started to lay out for us, but really how does this process of the development of the psyche unfold? How does Jung see that as happening?
Okay. They're looking at two different dimensions of life. And to put it simply, and keeping things simple is my specialty, Jung was focused on the individual, and Teilhard was focused on the big picture.
Right.
And Jung saw himself as strictly a scientist. Like a lot of people think he's a little too woo-woo in some of his ideas. He thought everything was all demonstrative of the scientific approach to things.
Right.
But I think he would think that Teilhard's ideas are based more on faith than they are on science.
Okay.
In other words, you would mention too optimistic. Jung might say it's wishful thinking. He might say it remains to be seen, whereas Teilhard is saying it's inevitable.
Right.
Jung was not as sanguine about the future of the human race as Teilhard was. And he usually kept pretty calm about things, but one of the few times he really got all worked up was when people were trying to blame God for what was going wrong in the world. And he said, oh, no. This is the responsibility of humans here. And if we are going to survive through probably about the fifth big cosmic crisis that the world has ever gone through, individuals are now responsible for this thing. But then he turned it right back into how individuals can do that. And he looked, for example, at the whole Christ pattern.
Right.
He said, this is the way to become a full human being, and that's enough to deal with. He said, where this whole thing goes, who knows? He could be hopeful, but Teilhard focused a lot, for example, on his understanding of the second coming of Christ.
Right.
Which, I think we would agree is not, Jesus descending on the clouds, but perhaps being built up from within as people over hundreds of years and thousands of years awaken to their own Christ consciousness. That's the second coming. And Jung's theory was this: look, let's just focus on that.
Right.
Okay, where this whole thing goes, that's out of everybody's control. And we're talking here about strictly faith, which may prove out to be right. But in the meantime, we're not really focusing on where the tire meets the road. And that is how people awaken to their full potential. And then he does a 180 and says, believe it or not, Christianity, if it's properly understood, could help people do this.
Right.
And just for example, just let me run through real quickly some of those major steps on this awakening to one's own Christ nature. Annunciation, birth, baptism, temptation, bar mitzvah, confirmation, public life, rejection, crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, Pentecost, and Assumption. These just happen to be, these 12 things, some of the universal steps that are found in Christianity, in particular the Catholic tradition. But here's where he says, but either they're crazy or I'm crazy. He said, this is meant to be about our own awakening.
Right.
But instead, what we have done with religion is make this all about what happened to Jesus. Oh, okay, what are we going to do this Sunday? Okay, the descent of the Holy Spirit and, what that meant back in apostolic times. He says, no, what does it mean for you to have an awakening of the Holy Spirit inside you?
How do you internalize that?
Yeah, and I'll just mention one other one. The Assumption. Mary is assumed body and soul into heaven. Okay? Nobody's ever gotten too excited about that. It's okay, that's what the dogma is. This is an official teaching of the Catholic tradition. But Jung thought it was fantastic. He said, if you understand this as the feminine being brought into the Trinity.
That's right.
So we now have a quaternity.
Again, he's looking at things symbolically.
Symbolically.
He's not saying dogmatically, what does this mean, right? Yeah.
But he also would say this, and I think this is where Teilhard would agree with him. If we say this is literal, all right, we're dealing with churches that are full of young university graduates, and this simple parish priest is doing his best up there, and he's talking about Mary was assumed body and soul into heaven. She was lifted up. And this young person, 25 years old, is sitting there
Right.
going, what is he talking about? Where is up and where is down in this universe? We are on a round globe
Right.
that's spinning on its axis, and this whole thing makes no sense.
And I'm thinking especially, too, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just
No,
having
go
the
ahead.
thought that if, you were a 20-something in the pews and you haven't had that kind of experience where you might go, oh, I think I might know what they're talking about.
Right.
It's not, it's not going to be like theologically sound, but experientially, I feel that.
Yeah.
I feel that sense of ascent or descent or abandonment or transfiguration or whatever that might be.
Right. But if, let's say, the priest might say, well, that's an unusual way to look at it, Andrew.
Right.
That's not exactly what the church is saying, but who knows? You might be up to something. But what the person gets is, oh, no. That's wrong.
Right.
That's heretical.
Right.
Don't believe that. That's the devil talking or something. So this young person, 25 years old, scratching their head and saying, okay, maybe we have to have a parting of the ways. And they walk out the door and they never come back again.
Right.
And Jung is saying, what a pity. If you could just transfer it to metaphor
Right.
rather than historicity, it would make sense.
Right.
Here's a simple Tom Legere analogy here. I keep everything simple, as you know. Let's just say 100 years from now, somebody picks up a newspaper and it says, lions kill bears. Oh my God, here it is, and this is scripture. I guess there was a fight between lions and bears.
Right.
But what it was is he picked up the sports page.
Right.
So is what was just said untrue? No, it's true, but it only makes sense on the sports page.
That's right.
So this is what Jung is saying.
Yeah.
I'm not saying take away the symbols and the sacraments and all that stuff, but see it in a different way. And then everybody can take a breath and see there is no contradiction here
Right.
between science and spirituality.
It's hard because there is definitely a binary that is more comfortable than staying in the gray, so to speak. Right? It's
sure.
easier to go on the side of black or white and not stay in the gray in the middle area. And it says a lot about the all or nothing thinking that's so common and pervasive. Where
Yes.
if that's on the scale of society, if that is what is being lauded as being the most important, in terms of empiricism and dates and science and all this stuff, then when someone is influenced on the level of taking that into the pews with them, then of course that's going to sound very antiquated and totally irrelevant. And I know this is something you and I have talked about before. We may have even brought it up in the first podcast, but the notion of putting new wine into old wineskins, right?
That's right.
When we do that, the old wineskins are unable to hold the new wine. They burst. We need the new wines that can hold the new wineskin. And that's everything from the metaphor, the ability to see things metaphorically, to the ability of, leaders of congregations and preachers especially to be internalizing these things themselves so as to deliver a message that is, authentic and speaks to the heart, so to speak, of people and is not being deflected off of the Kevlar of their brain because that doesn't, line up and resonate what I know to be true about science. When I went through all this schooling and I went to a Catholic school and I learned this about science, right? And that's, one specific example of someone that went to Catholic school. I get asked that question a lot when I bring up Teilhard and evolution as well. how do you believe that if you're a Catholic, and how does that work together that way? And it's the kind of thing where collectively, I'm going to speak to like the Catholic psyche,
Yes.
does not even know that the last few popes have all spoken of Teilhard favorably, that evolution has been
Right.
acknowledged as a natural process of our natural world and the unfolding of God in the world,
Yeah.
right? So these kinds of things are very base level, that our collective, or what's the word? Our communal psyches have not evolved past yet in order to become a more collective
Right.
psyche. We're a bit too still pigeonholed within our our Catholicity, or our Buddhism or Hinduism or our secularism or humanism or whatever ism we want to
That's right.
define ourselves as. Those in themselves become quite limiting in those ways.
Right. And it's a case of, and I guess we'll get to this too in the third discussion here, but how much of the old wineskin is worth saving here?
Right. Right.
Is it a case of just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic? For a lot of people, that's what renewal means.
Right.
Nip and tuck, change a little bit of this, change a little bit of that.
Yeah.
Oh, if we only had married priests, or if we only had women priests, or whatever the case might be, as good as all those things are, that's not the ultimate solution to our problems.
Right, because it's not the ultimate inner transformation that needs to be
No.
happening, both within the individual people within those institutions, and then within the institutions themselves.
Right. But you would have to go deep to change all this. And, it's sink or swim. I think eventually we're going to learn how to do it, but it may get worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
Because let's just say, looking at our seminaries today, you might say, well, okay, we have some problems, but hang on, folks, the Marines are coming. The cavalry's coming. These young priests are being taught something different today. Guess what?
They're not.
They're not.
Right.
They're being taught something more backward than was taught 50 years ago. These young men are coming out of the seminary, God bless them, trying to save the world, walking around in their cassocks and repeating the old formulas and scolding people. And the future just does not look bright.
Yeah. There is a certain recapitulation that way, and I really, maybe this is where my faith takes over, but hope that there is a recognition within those young priests that, okay, some of this stuff has value to it, symbolic value worth taking forward.
Yeah.
It meets a need within the psyche,
Yeah.
especially within the individual psyches of some people. I'm thinking like of those men particularly called to that,
Yeah.
a vocation, as well as to the people who really are truly fulfilled by their service in the pews.
Yeah.
That's a level, right? But I'm hoping that they see the great flaws within that too, and the shortcomings of staying at that level of comfortability, the problems that had and has created within the church, and how those all become very callous in a way. They're very external things, the teachings, the regalia, the habit, all that stuff, right, becomes very externalized, and in a way can just become very egocentric and egotistical,
Right.
as opposed to becoming an ego within a larger sense of self, like serving a body of Christ, right? Like the
That's
church
right.
is supposed to be. So I mean, that is my hope institutionally there within the church, and maybe that's my Teilhardian taking over, but I would like to think that. I mean, in the younger priests that I work with, there is a deep pastoral sense that they have, which is really affirming to see of young men, and you hope that's the kind of thing that is really encouraged to go forward. That sense of the heart, right? Teilhard says it's not a coming together of our heads. It's not a head to head or a hand to hand that we need. It's really a coming together of our hearts. It's a heart to heart.
Right.
So I mean, yeah, it's a kind of thing where people's needs are drastically different too. And then say like, younger guys were coming out of the seminary 20 or 30 years ago. And for these young guys who now are coming out to take these older teachings and ways with them, they're in the crucible to sink or swim, like you say, to see if, they can find a way to adapt. But, time will tell, I suppose.
But here's how radical this whole thing needs to be.
Right.
I gave that example of walking around with cassocks on. Okay, it's probably not fair, because that in itself is neither here nor there.
Well, but that is because that is shown as like these Pew studies not Pew studies, but they do into vocations and what are young men looking for. One of the top three things is the habit,
Identity. Oh
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And like Jung would just be probably banging his head against a wall during our conversation here. And he would probably even say, even you guys aren't focusing on the real issue here. Let them wear their habits.
Right.
Okay? Let them wear the black. But what the black should be pointing to is the death of the ego. Okay? If that's what it's pointing to, wear whatever you want to wear.
Right.
But instead, you have guys walking around dressed like that as a way of building up the ego.
That's right.
So, Jung is saying not only do things need to be understood metaphorically, but they need to be understood in the deepest sense of metaphor.
Right.
Like don't so much even worry about changing all of the smells and the bells and the regalia and all that stuff.
Right.
If you want to, keep it, but try to internalize it all.
Allow it to be transformative.
Yes, but that is not what's happening.
Right.
But then again, that's only 50 years. And sometimes I think, people like us, and this is one of the great things of Teilhard, to get this back a little more optimistically here, he has taught people like you and I and so many of us to think in terms of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. And right now, we get it. More and more people are picking up on these things, but the vast majority, I think, of people don't get it. And it's the blind leading the blind.
Yeah, and even beyond religion itself, in terms of people's awareness and where they're focusing it and where their attention goes, right? What is it? Energy flows where attention goes, or something like that.
Yes, of course.
What are we putting our energy into? What are our larger visions of the future that we're working towards? And I personally think, and this is again the Teilhardian in me, think that there are crises that are present now, that with this ever-present rise in consciousness, we're just going to be forced to face. Like, we're probably going to see some major issues with like food shortages and stuff like that going forward, just because of not COVID or anything like that, but just of how brittle and insufficient and unjust our food systems have been for so long.
Right.
We're hitting these critical points now where we are going to have to find new ways to everything from feed ourselves to try and be healthier, right? Many young people feel unfulfilled by the way that our country has encouraged people to be healthy like that over so much time, and people are, I think, at least in my experience, I'm starting to see them seeking out, not maybe new ways, but more dynamic ways of connecting with the planet, with the world, with each other. And part of that is, I think this is where I get some of my hope. There is a revival too, and like people turning back to traditional religion.
Yeah.
And it's not in a sense that I've picked up where it becomes like overzealous or preachy or annoying, but it's just kind of like, hey, this is something that's really important that we neglected, and maybe even in some cases we were taught to neglect.
Yes. Like
I remember back in the 90s and 2000s, it just seemed overwhelming to me. Like there was just this movement for atheism. And like if you're not, thinking atheistically, that means you're thinking at a lower level of consciousness, because you're not considering these new findings of, the quantum and the expansion of the universe and Stephen Hawking and all this stuff, right? And within that, there became like a very Nietzschean view of like God is dead, right? But now
Yes.
I'm seeing there a lot of revival movement, and I use that term, very widely, but a revival of the spirit, whereby
Yes.
people are turning back to
Yeah.
just things like even reading scripture, right? And like, what is the value to this?
Yeah.
And then we get into issues of interpretation and all that and how we're being led. But I think just that very movement is interesting. But that's what we tend to do as people when we reach these moments of chaos, both
Oh,
individually or collectively. We kind of turn back to the last sane moment we know, which is interesting that people are turning back to religion.
Yes.
When we are, like I said, so reactive at times to say something bad or to buck against it.
Right.
It's maybe let like you said, let my heart be open, right? Not my head so much.
Yeah.
So I can experience this deeper meaning, this symbolic meaning here. And I'm thinking too, like, this notion of like diving into things through symbol and metaphor versus Teilhard's scientific view, his empirical view of things, whereby the person of Jesus of Nazareth is not a symbol. He's not a metaphor. He is a real person. I mean, he can be, and his resonance can be interpreted and worked with in those ways, symbolically, metaphorically, right? But for Teilhard, time isn't a theoretic thing like it is for Einstein. Time is a real thing. Jesus was a real person. And for him, that was the proof in the pudding that this is possible, that we are evolving to higher states of complexity. We are evolving to a more whole sense of being that is not whole in the sense that it's perfect, but whole in the sense that it's integrated, and whole in the sense that its focus becomes that of loving in radical and dynamic ways. So, I mean, I think that there would be a divergence there in Teilhard and Jung with that. And I don't know that Jung would say, well, Jesus of Nazareth wasn't a real person.
No, he wouldn't say that.
Right? Like, he wouldn't say that. I know there's some people that go into that whole argument.
No, no.
Good luck, right?
Right.
But in terms of, looking at things as real, or, as an empirical piece of evidence versus not like watering it down to, but just reducing it in a way to be symbol or metaphor for Teilhard, and I would even say for Jung, is not integrated enough. We still need to find a way, Jung, right? We need to find a way to live these experiences. What the quote of Jung that I always love is that when you have something like a problem that is unsolvable in your mind, the best way to solve it is with your hands. So, I mean, even Jung has that admonition that we've got to put into practice this. So just an offering as, I'm looking at our notes that we had talked about ahead of time here and playing off that. And something very important to mention too, when it comes to Teilhard, the reality of this. The reality of the war for him was something that he couldn't bear. He couldn't bear it to the point where he said, God, you've got to help me with this. And in a way, so that help came through that larger vision. Now, that larger vision was what got him in trouble and what, set him on a lifetime of what he calls the road of fire. But for him also, there is no other road if we are really evolving. His experience on the front in war became definitive for him as the experience that he was to be having if he was really a part of that leading edge of evolution. He had to be on not just the front of human conflict, but the front of conscious reality as well, and conscious relationship in reality. I think that speaks a lot to the relationships he had too. He wasn't just in contact with people in his own circle within the church. Like we've already acknowledged, there was a lot of tension there, but he was connected with academics, he was connected with people in politics, he was connected with artists and scientists and people around the world in all these ways where it shows, I think, a degree of his personal integration of that way, where he was able to connect.
I think that's probably fair. And it's also fair to say that Jung was not as connected in an authentic way with people or in a meaningful way. He lived in his head. And, painting with a broad brush here, but Jungians tend to live in their heads. It's all about insights and new ways of looking at things. You don't hear or feel a lot, in my limited experience, I guess, about opening up the heart. It's like, whoa, what's all that about? So it could easily become too abstract.
Right.
Here's a simple example. As great as Jung was with all of his ideas, he didn't even want to define what it meant to be a Jungian, because that would be too much of a system, and he was against all systems.
Yeah.
It was all the individual, and he did not want to be pinned down in anything like that. So he was missing the boat. People said, for example, like, why don't you start a university? Okay, here you're a new guy. You're not a Freudian. There's a lot of schools that have Freudian majors. That's 99% really of the schools at the time.
Sure.
He didn't want to start a school. So he was almost afraid of that part of us that wants to concretize things.
Right.
Whereas Teilhard literally was a guy who loved to get his hands in the dirt.
Yes, and was seeking for that
right.
solidity in things.
Yeah. And authenticity. And you might as well get this one out here, too, just to get it out of the way. We don't want to slander anybody. But Jung was not a saint, okay? And a lot of his relationships with everybody from his clients to his colleagues to the way he treated his wife, a lot of that was rationalized in using people. It didn't pass the sniff test of authenticity. Okay, whereas with Teilhard, they were unorthodox. His relationships with these women, for example, he was a celibate guy. He didn't want to get married, but he always respected them.
Right.
And there's no evidence that he ever took advantage of people.
No.
Or objectified them. Whereas some of the stuff that our old friend Jung did, it wasn't pretty.
Right.
So there's an example, too, of what can happen if your heart is not calling the shots there.
Yeah, and it's something we've even kind of kicked around before about these levels of, like, for a man, of anima development, right?
Yeah.
And for Jung, maybe he was still hung up on one of those, precursor levels of really being integrated with one's anima in the sense of the feminine, whereby Teilhard.
Yes.
Because we're not getting into morals and stuff here, too.
No.
And like Jung's extramarital relationships, right? Like maybe there was a. So we look at this term, and this is getting a little complex here, but for Jungians, I think they'll appreciate it. The transcendent function within our psyche, or the self, capital S, is something that is produced when, or symbols of the self, pathways to the self, are produced when we are able to identify a tension within our life.
Yes.
And maintain that tension and not give out to either side. And, we're both married men. Being in a relationship, a married relationship especially, is a great tension that we enter into, for better or for worse, right? Till death do us part.
That's right.
But, I'm going to, again, this is not to look at this in like a moralistic way or anything, but those extramarital relationships in a way like are a giving out of that tension. It's like just like taking away from it. And when you don't allow yourself to be in that tension, and this is just me totally speculating. I don't want to get people all upset, but for Teilhard, this is how it worked for him as an individual person. He maybe maintained that tension through his relationship with the church, which was tenuous, through his relationships with other people, which were tenuous at times, not because of them being acrimonious, but really just because of factors of like distance and time, and them not being as connected as they are now in the world in which we live. Things are so easily accessible. That's just me being speculative, but I think that when we look at models of anima development, there are those models or those levels in which things are very Eve, right? They're beauty, they're voluptuous, they consume us in that way. There are the the levels of the whore. There are the levels of the Madonna, where it's just totally pristine and perfect. And then there is a level of Sophia, or wisdom, whereby it is all things being held together. The Madonna and the whore in some way being held together, because both have aspects of the psyche that we have then, through time and culture, turned into different archetypes and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And there's all something there worth learning. And when we can really immerse ourselves in those symbols in a way that just becomes a way of living and being, like Teilhard did, I mean, it's a pretty radical testament to what the transformative power that can have in a healthy sense.
Oh, yeah,
right?
sure.
Because these things can also go the other way, whereby these archetypes also have, quote unquote, darker elements to them, whereby if we're consumed by them, they can become, expressed through our personality if they're not integrated and made conscious. So yeah, I mean, I really have an appreciation for Jung too, and his resistance to uniformity in that way, whereby he was very willing to put his foot down with things and say, I'm not a metaphysician, I'm not going to comment on theology or spirituality, whereby he's so resistant to institutional thinking that he refers to define what a Jungian is. And I think that when we consider the great gift that he was able to share with us in terms of his experience with worldwide cultures, that takes a certain openness.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That takes a certain lack of holding to one's own anchor in a way. But yeah, I mean, his process is really neat to get into the whole story. Not to get into the whole story now, but of Bollingen and him going off in seclusion, and he's writing and carving things in Latin and drawing runes and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
That to me is like my introvert's dream. Like, why have a wife and kids and everything, but maybe someday I'll have my own little, hermitage to go into.
Well, see, that shows in his own way, he was trying to live these things out.
Right.
He was trying to test it all. And he's saying, okay, let's see if these things make sense. So he entered into his own desert experience. For a couple of years.
Yeah.
Freud didn't do that.
Right.
Freud was up in his head. So, he almost lost his mind. The way he pulled back from his work, isolated himself. But to him, that's the meat behind all this kind of stuff.
Right.
Where you don't worship Jesus. You follow Jesus.
Him. Right.
Yeah. Can we talk about Jesus a little bit, or should we hold off on that one?
Maybe let's save that for the next conversation in the future of religion. But
okay, good.
What I just took from this tongue-in-cheek was that institutional thinking will drive us into the desert, both in Jung's case and in Teilhard's case. In Teilhard's case, a lot more literally.
And in my case, by the way. That's another story. So it's true.
All of us in some way or another, but for sure. Well, it's been a pleasure to have this conversation again with you in part 2 here, Tom, and we look forward to our audience joining us for our final part 3.
Loving it. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.